So my name is Michael, and I'm here today with Wayne, and we're going to talk about a book by D.C. Schindler called Love in the Postmodern Predicament. Um, D.C. Schindler is somebody that, for me, I remember first hearing about via the work of Esther Meek, which some people out there might be familiar with. She's known for writing a book called Loving to Know. And she has some interesting philosophical work about epistemology and how it is that we know things. And also, so after finding out about him from that, I also watched some of his work on Balthazar and beauty. And he's somebody that's really kind of transfixed me with some of his ideas and sort of the radical conclusions they take him to in philosophy. But this particular book has a very interesting title, Love in the Postmodern Predicament. And he starts in the intro with this idea that very, very well-known phrase that Aristotle makes, that all men desire to know. And he takes this as kind of sort of the crux of his starting place, that this is a sort of fundamental component of what it means to be human. And then further, that quickly as he makes that statement, he kind of pivots out of it into a sort of shift in terms of what we think of as know, where it's not this sort of necessarily propositional knowledge. A lot of the examples he immediately gives of this knowing are more in line with what we would think of as sense experiences. Like he talks about like the bright yellow of a silk handkerchief or something like that, and that there's this certain pleasure that we take in these sense experiences that critically, as he points out, we have for their own sake. So that I guess he uses this adjective gratuitous, which sometimes people I think have a negative connotation with, but it's a sort of a sense in which it's not for some other purpose. It is for its own sake. And that we take delight in this knowledge, in this knowing for its own sake. And that this is, again, the sort of something core and deep about what it means to be human. And then he goes on in the introduction to make the case that in our kind of modern technological era, it seems like one of the core components of our technocratic culture is something that is actually fundamentally opposed to this, in terms of putting us at a remove from that kind of contact with reality, that kind of sense experience, which he equates to this knowing of the world, and such that we any experiences we have of reality are mediated through all these technical things, like for like your iPhone screen, or certain technical devices that kind of shield you from reality in a fuller sense. And so it's and then he concludes the introduction with a sort of call to specifically Christians to come back to a love of philosophy, which he defines philosophy specifically as the love of the real, which is I found a very, very compelling definition, in that there's a lot to unpack in that really kind of caught my interest. So in this love of the real, so what is he saying in a certain sense? So why do we need to have a whole discipline to the love of the real? In some sense, what that seems to indicate is that there is this sort of hiddenness within reality, so that you did, like, the surface level interpretations of things aren't necessarily exhaustive of what things are. And anyway, I'll stop there. I'm going on a long rant here for an introduction. But anything so far in what I've said strike with you, or any directions you want to take the conversation, Wayne?
Well, no, I think that's a good summary of the introduction. And of course, I mean, one of the things that stood out to me is his emphasis on love, love as a way of knowing, and which is kind of unique and something, at least in terms of epistemology, you don't tend to hear about the importance of love. So it is definitely more of a engagement with reality as opposed to just. And here I think is a interesting idea that kind of is related to the issue of technology, is that we are consumed with a pragmatic trying to effort to get at information, and it's all about information. And there's a way, of course, in which information can be distanced and is not the same thing as wisdom itself. So it's like we have more information than we've ever had at our fingertips through technology, but in a sense, the glut of information can overwhelm us to a point where it contributes to our inability to be attentive to reality about us, and in a loving and considerate and contemplative way. I love the fact that he talked about contemplation. So I just want to share just these are, I extracted them from my Kindle book, but these stood out to me. A couple of sentences here. Thus, if we appear to invert the more classical order of the transcendentals, of course, he's talking about goodness, truth, and beauty, and he's inverting those and putting beauty first. But he says it is only in order more fundamentally to secure the ultimacy of contemplation that lies at the core of the classical conception of man. I thought, wow, that's a very profound, pregnant statement. It opens up all kinds of possibilities. And I've had personal interest for years in just the discipline of contemplative prayer. So that in insofar as he relates it, to say that it lies at the core of the classical conception of man is to say a lot. And like, I want to know what you mean by that. It's very interesting. Secondly, and closely related to the first point, in the interpretation of human nature we offer here, we give an absolute priority to love. So, I'm well, first of all, I've already said something about the contemplative, that's just fascinating to me that he's placing evidently such emphasis on that, and whatever that means for him, it may not mean exactly the same as I understand it, but also in a sense, the subtle, maybe not so subtle, but an underlying emphasis is on human nature. And we're not just approaching epistemology and how do we know the good, the true, and the beautiful all in and of itself, but we're talking about it in terms of what it means to be a human being, which again is it may not sound that impressive or important or fascinating even, but I'm totally fascinated with what it means to be human, because not to get off on a bunny trail, I could easily get off on them, but the whole issue of being made in the image of God and being made, I believe, specifically in the image of Christ, it defines for us what it means to be human. And so therefore the depth of this, of our, you could say our anthropology, is just bottomless in some sense when you see it in respect to the humanity of Christ and our being made in his image. So anyway, all that's just to say, it's a great introduction. It intrigues me, and it offsets it against what if we're awake in the truest sense of the word, we're aware of the battle we're engaged in.
Yeah.
Live this way.
That what is a human kind of brings to my mind too as well the fact that throughout that I don't know if it's in the introduction or in the first chapter, he talks that this question, what is ... fill in the blank here, is the fundamental question of philosophy. And that there's something about that question. He makes the point that, in Socrates, in the dialogues that are recorded by Plato, that there's that this is the question that's always kind of kicking things off, and that in many times there isn't any sort of cut and dry answer that's given in the dialogue itself to what the question is. And in some sense that, Schindler makes the point that he's doing this not to say that the answers aren't important, but in some sense they give primacy to the question, and to say that the question in of itself has a value that's distinct from any answer you might give, that it's a useful kind of portal or doorway into a mode of being that does connect us towards this inwardness of things that philosophy is aiming to help aid us in bringing contact with. And again, this is in contradistinction to how so many people conceptualize philosophy today, which is as some sort of abstract manipulation of information and sort of logical syllogisms being organized such to create some far further branch of human knowledge that may or... And again, I feel like I may have mentioned this to you, but there was a conversation where Nate made the comment about philosophy being eminently practical that just really hit me like a ton of bricks, because we live in an age where, as Schindler points out, we have more philosophers probably than we ever have in terms of professional people that have that, have a quote unquote PhD,
right?
Which is, that PhD is a reference to philosophy, a desire, to know in a deep way. And yet we somehow, we don't have a sense that this whatever we're doing here has any real connection to reality whatsoever. Like the common man in the streets, that's their default response to, what they would think about what philosophy is. It's like, oh, that's, head in the clouds, no purpose whatsoever that could be connected to my my daily life.
Yeah.
And it seems like, what Schindler's trying to do here in this introduction is try and get us to think, well, maybe this is completely backwards, in that these words should have completely different meanings than we have presupposed heretofore. But
yeah.
And I do think Peterson, in the popularity that he's experienced, is primarily a mode of him trying to see that philosophy is practical. And I don't know if Peterson thinks of himself as doing philosophy. I think he thinks of himself more of as a scientist, or a psychologist, and or social scientist. But I don't know how he conceives of himself. I think he thinks of himself more in that vein. But he's not content with whatever empirical findings that he comes across. He uses those as a launching pad to say, well, what is this? And get into that mode of inquiry that is searching for the inwardness of things. And in some sense, I mean, I don't think it's such that journey is such a it takes so much of yourself to do that I don't think you can really begin to do that process without some starting point of belief that reality is good in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
So such that the effort to unwind and unfold that inwardness has some real merit and benefit to it that is that's not just a complete waste of your time.
Right.
It's not like you get to the end and it's complete some sort of ruse that you've been led into. I think that specifically is why, I don't know if Schindler words it this way, but this is how I kind of conceptualize it. That's part of why Schindler is making this reversal of the order of the transcendentals to put beauty first, because that beauty is sort of the thing that calls to us of the potential for that goodness that lurks at the heart of reality, that somehow like, and there's something, there's a felt change of consciousness. I'll use Barfield's language, associated with that encounter with beauty that is undeniable and doesn't, there's no working up of yourself to achieve it or anything like that. It just kind of comes upon you. There's a sort of sense in those moments that you're being seized upon as much as you're apprehending anything.
Right.
And so I think there's something profound in the fact that he is making this move to put beauty first.
It's kind of fascinating to try to ponder the relationship between wisdom and beauty. But first of all, just to ponder wisdom, to me, today in the currency of our language, you rarely hear the word wisdom. I mean, at least that's my experience, which to me must mean something. The very absence of the word in our vocabulary, practically speaking, means it's not something that we place great value upon. So just, like from a biblical perspective, wisdom, of course, is exalted so highly in the wisdom literature of Scripture, especially like in Proverbs. But yeah, I think though when we experience wisdom, when we experience the fruits of wisdom or the outcome of wisdom, it's something that exhibits beauty. It exhibits a certain form and balance, and yet there's an aliveness to it. It's not a dead or static thing. It's fecund. It's productive in the best sense of the word, because it's alive and growing. But for me, wisdom has come to mean, and especially when you think of it in terms of when Paul says that Christ is the wisdom of God. Mm-hmm. And you let statements like that dialogue with other statements, like from the book of Proverbs, that there's such a wonderful idea of how wisdom seems to be the skillfulness to bring together very different kinds of things together in a living harmony. That seems to me, in a way, to always be characteristic of wisdom. And of course, the motivation of that kind of to go after wisdom in that way, to me, would have to be love. Why should you care about there being a living harmony apart from that, apart from a love for whether it be creatures or those you're in relationship with, family or friends or enemies or whatever? It's the ability to bring about, in a sense, the shalom of God, the peace and the beauty and the life. So to me, to kind of be cognizant of that when we come to the literal meaning of philosophy, the love of wisdom, is something we don't have to, get out our dictionaries to understand that. I don't think but it's still something that we need to set our minds upon, our hearts upon and take note of when we do experience it in life. And I think it will engender an appetite for wisdom in us. But if we just live moment to moment, as I think we're prone to do in our cultural ethos, we won't stop and contemplate, stop and think, stop and appreciate the moments when we do experience the wisdom and the beauty that comes to us in life. But anyway.
Yeah. I like the term wisdom. And does he use the term wisdom in this chapter? I don't know. Or I feel like he uses reason more often, but I like wisdom because I feel like it has there's a connotation with wisdom, unlike reason, where we were messaging prior to our conversation, and I said something like reason, in my view, in the modern usage of the term, tends to collapse into just logic.
Yeah.
Which clearly that's not what's meant in terms of how it's been used historically.
Right.
But that seems to be how we use it today. Even if we do have some larger view of it, I think just the over usage of it in that kind of narrow way tends to make it kind of frames how we all think about it when we use the word.
Yeah.
Like there's like a Reason magazine that's like, it's like basically it's a skeptics magazine, right? It's like, if you can't be logically deduced, it's not real. And I don't think that Reason ever had that kind of
like rational
basis to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And wisdom seems to have within it, it has preserved within that connotation even today a sense of something ineffable, of something where you could even meet somebody that in some sense you might have a sense of them not even being in some intellectual sense very advanced or educated or erudite, and yet you would still consider them wise. And so there's a sense in which, and what do we mean when we use that? There's a sense that there's this there again, it's some ineffableness that is correlated to real world experience,
Mm-hmm.
to a life lived, and also I think within it a sense of having seen sort of the extremes of human existence, that the high highs, the low lows, the in-betweens. And it has, as you said earlier, like has somehow managed to skillfully walk between those without being, overcome in either extreme, and not having capsized in the midst of that. And there's something about that we intrinsically admire, and recognize, even if it doesn't fit well into modern categories. And so like, it seems like this word wisdom, we kind of reserve more for that kind of like thing we can't quite put our finger on. Whereas we would use reason to talk about maybe the college professor that we say, oh, he destroyed so-and-so with reason and logic,
Yeah. True.
That there's something there I like about that. And so I'm curious, what do you see the relationship between those two words? Or do you think there's some overlap there, in terms of like how Schindler is using reason and what you think of as wisdom, or are they two separate concepts altogether, or are they just kind of related but distinct? Like, how do you conceptualize those two things?
Good question. Not sure I can answer it very well, but yeah, I mean, I do think, not that I'm a classicist, I don't partly understand philosophy the way Schindler does to the depth that he does, but I think, like for instance, so often reason is associated with the image of God in man, or humanity, I should say.
Right.
But yeah, I definitely do not think that even if Schindler, even if and when he uses the term, I almost have to believe that he's bringing, at least in a sense, in the back door, the assumption of his classical understanding of reason, as opposed to the way that we might, through an Enlightenment filter, think of reason as opposed to other things, other ways of knowing that we claim anyway. So yeah, I think so. And again, to me, philosophy inevitably assumes wisdom. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess just simply to have the ability to reason is what enables us to come to have wisdom, I believe, because, the old saying, beware of unearned wisdom. We, there's definitely that skillfulness cannot come except through embodied practice. And that's one reason I love the way Vervaeke embraces a concept of wisdom that I can agree to. It also kind of, I have to just in passing mention it. It makes me think of the Tao, or the Tao, or however you want to pronounce that. But because I've just recently been looking again at the abolition of man, it's always fascinated me that Lewis picked up and used the term the Tao. As a Christian, it's odd and sort of shocking, but I think in a good way. But that, to me, that in a sense is wisdom that we see all around us.
Why do you think he chose to use the Tao rather than something out of his Platonist past?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if I've ever heard anybody really answer that adequately. Maybe Michael Ward does in his book. I've listened to just recently to.
Well, off the top of my head, if I was going to hazard a guess, I would say it's indicating some sort of integration between this nebulous force, this thing, the good, and reality itself. Like right. that I think in the Eastern traditions that's made more explicit in some sense, that it's a manifestation of reality itself. Whereas in the West, we seem to have gotten this very large divide between above and below, that we seem to not be able to do without in terms of how we conceptualize and understand the world, such that it's very hard, I think, even for myself, even after, doing a lot of work to try and undo some of that conditioning, let's call it, to then see that God, the good, the true, the beautiful, that it is fundamentally a part of reality itself. I can say that, I can articulate intellectually, but to have a felt sense of it, to live out of that, to have a moment by moment sense of gratitude and humility, to be in the presence of that all the time, I that's still a struggle. I step in and out of that all the time, and it's tremendously difficult for me not to slide back to that default of seeing these two things as disconnected in the extreme,
right?
And to even sometimes imagine that it's only my sort of human efforts of will that kind of can distantly connect them at certain points,
Very intentional.
Do what?
It has to be very intentional. In other words, to bring those back together, instead of kind of it just flowing in a way from your innermost being, which I think
Yeah, well,
yeah.
it's interesting because like so I'm another book I'm reading is this book called The Dark Night of the Soul. I think I mentioned it to you about it's not the actual St. John of the Cross book, but it is referencing the ideas of Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross, and it's from the perspective of a guy that was he's like a psychiatrist, and he's reflecting on these ideas, and he's doing so in a very I really like the book in that I feel like it's covering the deepest ideas possible, but it's doing it in a very unpretentious way.
Yeah.
But one of the early points of that he makes right away is that it's not really clear in this Dark Night of the Soul what's going on in terms of these traditional ideas of active and passive, right? In terms of what am I doing versus what is God doing? It's not really clear which is which. There's this sort of sense in which it's always a both and.
Yeah.
And for me, encountering that has been really helpful because again, again, I think this is a modern thing that we always, as a means of understanding the world, we try to oversimplify everything into sort of binaries of saying, okay, it's going to be this or that. And that is, I think that's an absolutely helpful way of limiting the complexity of the world and making decisions. And sometimes you just kind of have, when it comes down to making certain kinds of decisions, you almost always have to do that in some sense. Because you can't, if you're going to live somewhere, you got to live in this place, you got to live in that place. You can't kind of like half it between the two.
Right. Yeah.
It is a lot of these decisions we get forced into these binary modes, but that, in terms of more these larger conceptions of reality, like, truth, goodness, and beauty don't compress well into those same binaries. And so it becomes much more difficult to do that. And it actually, I think, in certain cases, it hides more than it illuminates or helps us to see. And this is kind of what I meant earlier when I was talking about reason devolving into logic, because that's kind of what logic is, and what it does is it constructs a system whereby you can have inputs and you get to definite outputs, and it's rigorously done, right?
Right.
You have a flow chart, you get to A, you either go in this way, or this way. You don't like and within that system, because it is a smaller, representation of reality. It's an oversimplification within that system. Yeah, you always have a way to go, but how well that small box maps into the larger world. I mean, I think we all know that doesn't really work, and yet it's always what we're trying to do in some sense, because it's all we have available to us, right? I mean, the structure of reality is so infinite relative to the finite resources of my own mental capabilities, such that I'm always playing that game.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, and what we've seemed to have done in modernity in particular is we've gotten really good about narrowing the scopes of inquiry into very specific areas, so that we can have this kind of analytic skill applied, into degrees that like people before us could never imagine, spending a lifetime on, this one little detail that somebody has a PhD in, right?
Right.
And so it's difficult for me to conceptualize because it does see, Yeah, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this because in some sense it seems like, and you work in technology too, so it seems in some sense that there are real goods that have been achieved by this method of becoming over, more and more specialized in these little areas, and to the point where somebody makes some breakthrough that allows them to, um, create something like a state, like a what we have now for digital technology, and the manipulations that we're able to do with that. That there seems to be something fundamentally good about what we're able to do with that, and yet it's also, we only have so much limited bandwidth, and if we're taken up with these sorts of endeavors, it seems to like not leave much left over for more loftier conceptions or contemplation
Right.
that you're making reference to earlier.
Yeah. 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 Well, it remains a challenge for me, even at my age, and hopefully within sight of retirement from this career. But yeah, it's just such a significant shift. It's like the desire of my heart is somehow, as unimaginable as it sounds, somehow to know Christ in the code, you know,
Yeah.
to experience him there, because in some way or another, I believe he's all pervasive. He feels everything
Yeah.
every way. So, but yeah, it's a real struggle and battle. I think though, if I have learned, and I don't know that I have very much, if I've learned anything about just a contemplative attitude and disposition toward life, I think it's grounded in the practice and the discipline of contemplation or contemplative prayer.
Right.
I know different people have different, at least slightly different perspectives on what that means. It's kind of hard to pin down, but it mainly means being still, and that's so countercultural.
Yeah.
And so being still, being quiet. I think about Paul. Paul says, I forget which epistle it's in, but he says, make it your ambition, and that should capture our attention alone. Make it your ambition to lead a quiet and peaceable life. It's like, really? I thought we were supposed to go out and, turn the world upside down for Jesus. But I believe in a sense, hidden within that statement is an assumption about, it's about contentment, which I think you can't just make yourself content. The only way you can be content, and Paul said, I've learned the secret of contentment. And that's a very technical word, secret.
Mm-hmm.
There, it means I've been initiated into the mystery. That's what it literally means. And so I've learned the secret of contentment. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And that's a lot of people like to quote that, and I do too. But I think it means something profoundly more deep, that Paul was able to know Christ in such a deep way that he was a fulfillment of his every desire, ultimately.
Right.
So that's the source. But I think that the way, I don't know this from personal experience in any absolute sense of the word, but I believe my intuitions and what little experience I've had lead me to believe that comes by setting our gaze on Christ and all that means contemplatively, and seeing Christ who fills all things in every way, everywhere. So, all that has to do, again, it harkens back to what Schindler says about something about the core understanding a man in a contemplative way is just like, yeah, that's very fascinating to me. And you've read more of the book than I have. And so I'm hoping it opens this thing up maybe somewhat more.
Yeah.
But anyway.
So in that contemplation, do you find that inwardness of things necessarily comes with that in your own experience?
I think
of trying to practice this?
Yeah, I think it predisposes you to being I like to think, I may have read it somewhere, but I like to think of it this way, that as you engage in the discipline of contemplative prayer, it in a sense creates a buffer around your soul so that you're not in raw contact with the world around you and all the things and stuff and demands and, all the bad stuff, the false understandings and accusations or whatever, the road rage on the way to work or what, that there's in a sense a buffer around your soul that that at least for me personally, I just kind of sense that I'm not reactive. And so just by virtue of that, I'm able to pay attention to the birds of the field and to the lilies. I remember walking into work one morning and I actually in a sense stopped, at least mentally, and considered the little birds that were lighting. And of course it brought all kinds of thoughts to my mind. And then it just opened up in a very, I don't know, almost a mystical experience for me later that day. So but let me say quickly, what I've found mostly is darkness and silence. And so, but in God,
that's the term used in that book, The Dark Night is Sold. And the darkness is it's not necessarily a negative thing is right. The point. It's, exactly. And I think in some sense, there's the sense in which in the darkness is where you find the uncreated light.
But it's very challenging in our modern day world or postmodern world. We can just so easily gratify what Paul would call the lust of the flesh, so to speak. And they're not necessarily bad desires, but we can just overindulge in, Netflix or whatever. And nothing against Netflix per se, but, I can waste tons of hours watching TV when I probably should be doing other things and setting my mind on other things. And so anyway, it's a great challenge.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You kind of stopped me in my tracks here now that I'm thinking about my own ways of moving in the world and how counter they are to this most of the time.
Yeah. And a large part of this is due just as Schindler says, to technology. And it's not that technology is bad, but it makes the overabundance of entertainment and amusement, which means not to muse. So, yeah.
I never knew that before. That makes sense. I mean, the A prefix means a negation.
Right.
Wow. Huh. I want to read a quote from the book. I wish I'd done this earlier, but this is kind of going back on this idea of this need for contact with reality. And I'll just ask you to kind of reflect on it and what it kind of brings up for you. Okay. He says here, this is from the introduction. He says, to observe then that we take not just pleasure, but delight in sense experience is to indicate that we enjoy this contact in itself for its own sake, not merely for the various benefits it may bring. If it is indeed the case that the senses are the gateway of the real, this delight means that there is something fundamentally good about this encounter with the world, about the mere fact of our coming face to face, so to speak, with things that are quote unquote other, things that are different from us. In this sense, the desire for knowledge is at root a desire for this intimacy with the world. To say moreover that this desire arises from our nature, to say that this desire is a fundamental part of what makes us human, is to say that we are made for this contact. Encountering reality is a basic part of the meaning of human existence. So I'm curious how that maps onto this contemplative vision
Well, boy, that could open up a whole world of
It doesn't have to be precise, just whatever kind
yeah,
of
yeah, yeah.
whatever comes to mind.
Right. Um, the contemplative gaze, I you, we've discussed this, so I've been pretty obsessed with one particular passage in 2 Corinthians 3. And so I filter everything in a way as I bring it into relationship with this passage because it just seems that prolific to me. But to me, it is, if Paul ever comes close to talking about contemplation specifically, or contemplative prayer even specifically, it's 2 Corinthians 3, where even the NIV translated, we all do contemplate. I think I know it uses some form of the word contemplate,
Yeah.
and of course, a more literal translation is we gaze or we behold as in a mirror. And I think it's unfortunate, like the NIV even drops the word mirror completely, which is a mistranslation to me, because the word there is mirror. It means literally to look at yourself in the mirror, which in itself is very provocative.
Yeah, very.
But anyway, this contemplative, in terms of I can't remember the exact phrasing what you just read, but the idea, in a way, of intimacy with the things, especially I think the created things of the world about us, that there's a kinship, that there's a kinship between me and the tree I'm looking at right now, and so that I don't look at it merely as an object that I could cut down and burn up for firewood or what have you. But first of all, just because the tree and I both exist, we both participate in the being of God. In him we live and move and have our being. But beyond that, even, to me, this whole mystery, and to me that's how Paul frames it, the mystery of Christ, in whose image we're made, is the one that created that tree. And there's a way in which, to me, the Christ who created that tree is the eternal archetype of humanity. He's the eternal God-man. Now, I'm not saying he's always existed in the flesh, but what I am trying to allude or gesture toward is that in a way that tree was made for me. It was made for Christ, but I'm made in his image. And so I'm coming more and more to have a very anthropocentric view of creation. But it's not, it is made for me, but only insofar as I or any other human being is made in the image of the archetype, Jesus Christ. It's made by him and for him. But because I'm made in his image, that tree was also made for me. And in a way, I'm made for that tree. And you probably heard people talk about, I know various mystics at least have talked about the fact that we're the microcosm of the universe, that in a sense we contain the universe and the universe contains us, microcosm, macrocosm. So it's like there's this kinship and resonance that I have in a sense in the being of God that to me is just like it's explosive in terms of meaning. I don't know if that made any sense.
Yeah, it's definitely a mind bender for sure. And but in some sense, what you're saying has to be true, even within a modern skeptical sense. Otherwise, this capacity to know and to explore and to unite these discoveries in some meaningful way, that keyword meaning it presupposes everything you just said. And yet again, we, as Schindler's pointing out, we haven't necessarily made some sort of thoroughgoing contest against that underlying metaphysics you just laid out.
Right.
We've supplanted it with the bourgeois metaphysic, which is a metaphysic that is not, it's just not a metaphysic. It does just enough to cast a sort of doubt or disbelief in the whole process whereby one engages with one's own metaphysic to kind of engage these things more deeply. It casts just enough doubt on that activity so as to persuade one not to engage in it.
Yes.
Again, that's sort of what I was referring to earlier about philosophy not being practical. To say, yeah, that's not worth anybody's time and energy to do that, because right. You can't fundamentally get to any sort of base ground truth reality. So don't bother.
Yes.
And whatever you find there is going to be, it'll be personally true for you, but not universally so.
Exactly.
So why waste the effort to find some knickknack that only you can see? Whereas what Schindler's saying is quite the contrary, that in these ultimately moments of kind of idiosyncratic personal moments that will never be replicated in the history of the universe, in these moments of contemplation you're referring to, that we're encountering the absolutely extremes of the universal simultaneously as well.
Yes.
Which is it's a blow the mind kind of moment to take that real.
Right.
To be real.
Yeah. To me, I don't know if it'll make sense, but it connects with, again, Paul saying about the unsearchable riches of Christ.
Mm.
There's no bottom to it in the sense. So, yeah.
That's really
it's
good.
Not just the Christ that's up here and, way up in the heavens. And it's the Christ who fills everything in every way, as Paul says in Ephesians. So anyway, yeah.
Gotcha. Well, I think that might be a good place to close out. I think we kind of mostly covered the introduction. I think we could probably do a more thorough treatment of chapter 1.
Yes.
With if I did some better notes. But any last thoughts before we close out?
Not really. I've just really enjoyed this, and thank you for taking time to do it as well, Michael.
Yeah, definitely.